Welcome on in, golf fans. It's your boy Gsluke here with our DFS preview for this week's Bermuda Championship. Going live a little bit earlier than usual. Got some NBA action going on tonight, so want to make sure I've got time to set my lineups before lock. But excited to bring you guys what to expect for golf this week. We'll go through the weather, little chalk report for you guys, all of your live questions throughout the live stream, and make sure we're ready to go for all of our exposure this week. So whether it's for DFS, props, outright bets, you name it, feel free to go ahead and fire those questions down in chat. And because Florida did legalize sports betting this week, Hard Rock app is live and active for us Floridians, something that I'm going to be talking about a lot more on stream and potentially even more so with the content. So if you're betting, doing first round leaders, that sort of fun stuff, feel free to go ahead and fire on those questions as per usual. But we'll go ahead and start with a look at the course in the weather, which is usually the good place to start, right? It's the proper place to start looking at a slate. And the wind, the weather here has a huge impact. So before we even look at the weather, look at what's going to happen over the first 2 days, I want to show you how big of an impact the weather can play here. So last year, the first two rounds were extremely calm. It was relatively receptive coming into the event, very similar to what you're going to see this year. Just for an idea of how receptive it's going to be, Adam Scott said it's one of the softest courses that he's seen for quite some time. And on top of that, they've gone rain 5 of the last, I think, 8 days over there in Bermuda. So it's been over 1.5 inches of rain the last 7 days, which means that the scoring average is probably going to play on the easier side, right? Even if it's playing super windy. Adam Scott was quoted as saying that he thinks the people are going to get after it. And that's something probably 20, maybe even like closer to 25 under par might end up winning, which is not what we've seen, right? 19 under par won last year. That was one of the easier golf tournaments that we've seen. 2022, only 15 under won. Back in 2021, 15 under won this golf tournament. And then back in 2020, you saw that 24 under par winner. So that year, I think, is maybe a little bit more comparable to what we're going to see this time around. But just to give you an idea of some of the round-around volatility, right, when it comes to the scoring, I mean, look at this, right? So back in 2020, it played maybe a little bit windier days of 1 and 2 than it did over the weekend. It got twice as easy, right? Went from about 0.7 strokes under par to 1.5 strokes and then 2.4 strokes under par there on Sunday. Last year, right, what I was kind of getting to before, first 2 days, we played 3.2 under par and then 1.9 under par for day 2. Day 3, 0.21 over par, right? All of that is the wind. All of that comes down to how blustery it's going to be out there. Let's look at 2022, right? Let's give you an even larger sample out here. So 2022 played over par in round 1, right? 1.7 over. That is as hard as it's going to get around Port Royal Golf Club. Day 2, 1.7 under par, a 3.5 shot difference. Same thing for round 3, right? 1.9 under par, and then 0.66 over par. The point of me pointing this out is that the weather matters at this golf course, and that is extremely evident, very obvious, right, when you're looking at these averages. So when we hop over here and try and figure out what we're dealing with for this week, we want to take a look at the weather, right? And if there's going to be any sort of edge to play, just know that it's probably not going to be like a 0.2, maybe a half a stroke difference. This golf course causes sometimes 3-stroke difference, right, out there with the scoring averages. So when we take a look at the weather for Thursday, we're going to take a look at a few different models out here. This is windy.com, by the way. The weather station that we're using is directly on Port Royal Golf Club, so makes it real easy for us to find this data. And you can see all the models pretty much agree here. So we're going to go through the 4. So first off for Thursday, right, calling for slightly higher winds in the morning than the afternoon, which is backwards to what you would expect, right, for most forecasts, right? Typically, the mornings are a little bit calmer than what we get in the afternoon. That's not the case for most of the forecasts on Thursday. You can see this ECM model here is calling for about 9 to 10 mile an hour sustained winds for much of the morning hour out there. In terms of your wind gusts, close to 20 miles an hour to start the day. So the wind kind of dies down, right, as Thursday progresses. And by the time we get to the weekend, or say not the weekend, right? The afternoon hours, getting way ahead of myself right there. But yeah, by the time we get to the PM hours, right, it's perfect weather, right? It goes from like 9, 10 mile an hour sustained winds, closer to like 3, even 1 mile an hour sustained winds out there towards like 3 or 4. And then the wind gusts, right, they go from nearly 20 miles an hour to start the day down to even 6 miles an hour, right? By the time that play is going to be finishing up. So for the first day of action, right, the ECM model is certainly calling for it to play a little bit easier out there. But if we look at even just a little bit further out there, the GFS model agrees, right? They're calling for a similar split. In fact, they're calling for upwards of 10 to 12 mile an hour wind gusts. It's just a sustained winds out there tomorrow morning. Icon model, maybe a little bit less pronounced, but certainly much higher wind gusts during the morning hours, and then slightly higher sustained winds. Medio Blue model, same thing. Actually, maybe even a little bit more extreme, right? Slightly higher winds that you have in the afternoon. Now, if we go over here to Friday, it's going to continue, right? That edge that we were talking about before continues into the next day. So day one, right, PM wave looks a lot easier. Well, on Thursday, the AM wave looks easier. So first off with this ECM model, slightly lower wind gusts in the morning. And of course, like if everything was equal in terms of the wind out there, you definitely want the guys going off early, right? The receptive greens, you're going to have a better chance of holding the green complexes out there. You're going to have slower greens, more pristine green complexes to putt on, right? When everything is equal, you want the AM guys. And on Friday, there are a few models that are actually calling for higher winds in the afternoon. So you can see this GFS model is pretty flat, I'd say, on Friday, right? Maybe slightly lower winds in the morning. You can see it's closer to like 10 miles an hour at the start of play, and then it gets closer to like 13 miles an hour by the afternoon. But this icon model, a little bit more pronounced than that one, right? It starts out at about 6 mile an hour sustained winds, goes up to that 12 mile an hour mark that you've seen on the other forecasts. And then Medio Blue, same kind of thing, right? It's really not that big of an edge on Friday, right? It's more so this edge on Thursday that we're looking at. But like we said, all things equal, right? If it's going to play flat on Friday, which could very well happen, right? The winds could be pretty consistent the entire day. You want the AM guys anyways. They're probably going to have that 0.3 to 0.5 shot difference just based on the receptiveness and the greens themselves. So the way that I see this situation out here, and the reason why we started out by looking at these averages is I think that if you're just looking at this like it's an event in North Carolina, you're doing this wrong, is what I want to point out here, right? The reason why we looked at the averages before is there's a 3.5 shot difference, right? Between day 1 and 2 back there in 2022. There was a 2.5 shot difference, right? From round 3 to round 4 in that same year. That's because it's a coastal, wide open golf course, right? There's no trees out there to block the wind out there. So if there's going to be any sort of edge, right? And on Thursday and on Friday, right? We're not talking about massive edges. It's going to play out a little bit more than you'd expect. So maybe at a North Carolina course, right, it's like a half a stroke advantage that we're dealing with out there. Well, at this sort of golf course, it's probably going to be closer to like a stroke advantage, right? Maybe even double, even 3 times the advantage that you'd see at most golf courses. So if you're going to play one wave or the other, I certainly would play the PM AM guys. I don't think you have to only play guys from the PM AM wave. But if you were trying to break a tiebreaker, if you're trying to take some of your like 6, 7K golfers, that's where it really comes in handy, right? If you're just trying to find a few guys down there in the 7K range to add and round out your player pool, right? Try and find your favorite 3 or 4 PM golfers, right? I think that's a good way to go after it. Sometimes it can be a little bit hard to hunker down, right, on your favorite plays down low. Maybe make your list of your favorite 12 to 15 guys in that range, and then only play the PM guys, right? Take the 5, 6, 7 of them that are playing in the PM wave, and use them rather than their AM counterparts. There may or may not be an edge, right? But just know that it is usually pretty pronounced when you have any sort of change in the winds out there, at least at a Port Royal Golf Club. So now we'll hop over into the DFS side. There's a little bit I want to talk about from that end, because this is a week where people are going to be pretty lazy, right? It's a fall series event. There's not nearly as much interest on this sort of week, which makes it one for the DFS grinders. And for the ones that are able to go out there, project ownership correctly, this is the week where I think you're going to see those sort of players shine. So I spent a ton of time on my ownership this week. In fact, I probably put in over 10 hours putting together this ownership, and pretty proud of what I put together, because on a week like this, it is all about game theory, right? We can talk about that weather edge all we want. I'm going to be playing that weather edge, but after that, right, when you're trying to, pick which PM golfers that you want to take, it comes down to game theory, right? If you're choosing between 2 golfers that are identical, let's say they're both in the PM wave for the sake of this argument, and one is 20% owned, one's 15% owned, I'll play in the guy that's 15% owned all day. This is the part of the schedule where recent form means nothing. A player's modeling at this golf course. means something, but it's not the end all be all, right? This is an extremely volatile event. It is an extremely weak field event. And to go out there, finish top 5, or even win this golf tournament, you don't have to have nearly as much of a ceiling performance. I mean, we've seen guys like Lucas Herbert, right, win at this golf course, who completely shed the mold of who you'd expect to win. Most people, right, expect accurate drivers, right? It's a short golf course, and they're really looking for solid putters, right? And Lucas Herbert, a solid putter, but is not an accurate driver of the golf ball. So when you're trying to make your plays this week, right, a lot of people are going to look at course history. That's where a lot of the chalk is. Before we hop into the actual chalky players, just know that a lot of the guys that are highly owned are guys that have played well here before, right? So like a Brendan Todd, for example, who's won this golf tournament, right, is way up there when it comes to the course history. You see him projected highly owned. The guys that you want to play, right, they're lower owned guys. Take the guys that don't have the good course history, right? So it's not just Brendan Todd. Lucas Herbert's getting a little bit of attention, but like a Ben Griffin had a really good finish last year, right? Part of the reason that I'm playing him this week is why he's relatively chalky. Taylor Pendress has a top 5 finish himself. That's why he's relatively chalky this week. Alex Smalley, I believe it's like 2 top 15s out there the last 2 years. That's why he's 21% owned. I mean, the whole way down the board, right? Matthias Schmid, I believe, had a decent finish here last year. The form's pretty good for Schmid. But down to like guys like Brian Gay, I've got it like 5.5% ownership. The reason why all of these players are getting ownership is because of their course history. And now there are a few of them that I'm playing, right? Full transparency, I'm playing Brian Gay, right? There are core plays like Ben Griffin that I'm still getting to, right? Despite them being 20% owned. But your entire player pool for this week can't be all those players, right? It can't just be all the guys that have the amazing course history. This is that random event. There's going to be plenty of random poppers this week. And if your DFS lineups, especially in large field GPPs, aren't reflecting that randomness, aren't taking on that game theory approach, then you're doing it the wrong way, right? You're going to see some random up top go off, right? It might even be like an Alex Noren that goes off in the AM wave and ends up breaking the slate at 14.2%. I'm not playing Noren this week, so I hope it's not him just for my sake, but it could very well be an Alex Noren. It could be a Doug Gim, right? He was chalky the last few months. I'm not playing him this week, right? He's an AM wave golfer. Wasn't really loving him anyways, but he could certainly go off at 11.9%. The reason why I'm, pointing these sort of guys out is just because you really like someone with their modeling this week does not mean that they're a for sure play this week. Like I know Brendan Todd, really good course history, right? I'm playing Brendan Todd this week. Just for full transparency, there are some of these chalky players that I'm getting to, but your entire player pool, all of your exposure can't just be the chalky players, right? You have to be mixing in a few lower owned plays at some stage to get to that differentiation. So I want to point out some of that chalk. It's all pretty predictable, right? It comes down to that course history. But what I'm going to point out here, right? We already talked about the core plays during my DFS preview earlier in the week, are some of the pieces of differentiation that I'm considering. One piece up here in the 9K range, which honestly, he could have easily been 10 grand in this sort of field, would be a Lucas Glover, right? He's an AM wave golfer, so I don't love that for him, but I do like the skill set fit, right? Unlike like a Doug Gim, some of the other guys that maybe wasn't as wild about getting to in the AM wave, Lucas Glover does intrigue me because if you're looking for a player with good form, right, he checks that box, of course. Like I said, though, we don't want to look at the stats too much here, but in terms of long-term pedigree, solid players from 150 yards and in, Lucas Glover checks that box emphatically, right? He's one of the better wedge players that we have in this field. He's a decent driver when it comes to accuracy, right? So if you're really looking at the course mold, right? What we're looking for in a golfer out there. Lucas Glover kind of fits that. And if you're looking for somebody that's been playing golf, I think that's kind of like an underrated thing at this sort of event is there are guys like Brendan Todd who haven't played for a few months. And then you have Lucas Glover, right? Who's been playing almost every other week, right? Out here during the fall swing. I would much rather have the active golfer, right? The one that's been able to shake off the rust a little bit over the last few weeks. It's the Glovers of the world that are going to differentiate your lineups and that you need to mix in with some of the chalk, right? So let's say you're starting with maybe an Adam Scott who's a little bit chalky, right? 20.7%. Or Brendan Todd, right? 20.9%. I'd say that he'd be extremely chalky when it comes to your top end plays. Rather than going, let's say, a Brendan Todd and then a Ben Griffin, right, as your second man in, maybe this is where you take a shot on an AM wave golfer, right? You try and go for that slightly lower owned play. I think just as high upside out there with the Lucas Glover, and just hope that the first 2 days that he outperforms his wave, right? He can go out there, survive the first 2 days. We've seen guys like Justin Thomas, right, win out of a 3-stroke differential, right, in the negative way out there at the PGA Championship, it happens, right? And we don't need Glover to win, right? Top 5, top 10 would be just fine at $9,500. So there are plenty of leverage plays to get to, but just the one thing to guard against, as per always, right? It's always the case, right? With these main slates, is to avoid just taking all chalk, right? It's okay to mix in a few pieces, but you don't want your entire player pool to be that chalk. In terms of guys that you can mix in at relatively low ownership, Davis Riley, I think, is another AM wave golfer that you could take. He's a player that's extremely volatile, which for large field GPPs, at least to me, is a huge selling point. I love golfers that have a huge range of outcomes, because really the difference in a large field GPP between someone going out there just hardly making the cut, right, just making it to the weekend, scoring 50, 60 DraftKings points, and then them missing the cut, right, scoring like 30 DraftKings points is nothing, right? Those extra 30 points that you're getting for like a 40th place finish mean nothing, right? It might help you min cash out there, right? Earn like an extra $8 back on your entry, but that's not how you go out there and grind out positive EV, right? All of the positive EV when it comes to playing in a large field contest are up top, right? It's with your top 5 percentile payouts, right? That's where all of the outcomes are going to be, where it's plus EV, right? All of the ones where you're just hardly min cashing are hugely negative EV outcomes, right? It's like it's positive on that single play, but long term it means next to nothing. So that's why in large field GPPs, like I'm okay with the Davis Riley burning me with a missed cut. Like it happens quite a bit. The guy misses a lot of cuts out there, but when he makes cuts, when he's playing well, right, when he has his best stuff, he usually converts that into contention, right? He doesn't always top 5, top 10, right? He is known to choke over the weekend a little bit, but he at least gives you a live entry, right, when he's out there playing pretty well. So I'm okay with Davis Riley as an AM wave little shot. Let's see. MJ Daffy's in the PM wave, right? He's a little bit overpriced, but he's also lower owned, right? I think he's a pretty solid piece of differentiation out there. Let's point out a few more. Let's see. Down in the 7K range, there are some pretty chalky pieces, but like a Ben Martin, right? 4.9%. He's not super low owned, but he's low owned enough, right, to give you some sort of leverage out there at just 4.9%. Down here towards the bottom end of the sevens, and Smotherman's 9%. That's pretty crazy. I was going to say that he was a leverage piece, but that's definitely not the case. He's actually pretty chalky out there at 9.1%. But let's find you another relatively low-owned player. And I'm playing Smotherman, just to tell you, even at that ownership, I'm still taking him, but he's definitely not a leverage piece. David Lingworth down here at $6,800, right? He's 2.1% owned, decent track record around Port Royal Golf Club. It's like these sort of plays, right? If you're taking a bunch of chalk up top, right? Like in my lineups, for example, right? If I'm going to play a 9.1% owned player down here in the 7K range, who's significantly higher owned, right, than most of the guys around him, right? Like Kelly Craft's 8%, Camilo's, right, 6.3%, right? Like they're kind of high owned, but compared to most guys, right, he's like 3 times higher owned than Austin Cook, right? He's twice the ownership as a Scott Piercy, for example. If I'm going to take an Austin Smotherman, I better not have Brendan Todd, Ben Griffin, right, as my first 2 players in, right? That would just be an absolute train wreck. Heck, it can't even be like Adam Scott, Ben Griffin. Heck, it can't even be like Adam Scott, Taylor Pendrith, right? If you're going to take 2 20% owned players up top, right, like you can't take the Austin Smothermans down low, right? So that's why I wanted to point out some of the chalk, some of the lower owned players that you can get to, and just know that if you're going to take any chalky pieces in this kind of field, you do it up top, right? The 6, 7K players this week are absolute dog shit, right? Would normally be in the 6K range for most golf tournaments. You shouldn't be playing mega chalky guys down there for your entire player pool. So like if your player pool this week in the 7K range is Russell Knox, Kelly Craft, Smotherman, Villegas, Ryan Moore, Peter Malnati, Patton Kazire, and then Schmid, Adam Long, Justin Lauer, you're doing something wrong. Okay. If you're taking all the super mega chalky plays down there in the 7K range, your process is a little bit busted, right? If you're going to take the chalk up top, if you're going to play all that donkey chalk together, do it up there in the 9 and 10K range, right? That's the range to go out there and do so. Let's see. Is there any questions down in the chat that we need to go over? Looks like we're good to go for right now. If that's the case, go and talk about some lineup construction. If you have any players that you want to deep dive on, feel free to go ahead and let me know. But as per usual, all of my player pool and whatnot is going to be on the Patreon. So if you want to know any of my exposure, I'll give you guys a few bits and pieces for the live stream. But yeah, for the actual spreadsheets to see all of my exposure, you guys know where to check that out. So let me bring up Draftkings, bring up a golf contest, and we'll build a few lineups together. We'll do a couple do's and a couple do nots out there when building your lineups. And then afterwards, we'll talk some prop stuff. So we've got the Draftkings contest up. Let's see. Yeah, this is for the main slate. Want to make sure we're dealing with the right set of pricing out here. And let's go over the do nots first, right? What you want to make sure you're avoiding when you're building your lineups. So I talked about this Todd Ben Griffin start probably being a little bit too chalky for my liking. It's not that these two players alone are going to completely tank your lineup. It's that the rest of your lineup, you're going to have next to no flexibility, right? If you have two 20% owned players in your lineup, you're going to need at least 3 pivots with your last 4 spots. And by pivots, I mean sub 5% owned players. So just to give you an idea, right? You have 7,600 remaining down here in the 8K range, right? That means no Davis Riley, right? He's 10% owned, right? And that would even be considered a pivot in that range, right? He's one of the lower owned players. You're really going to have to fish to take a low owned guy here. So for example, Dylan Wu, just to cross check with my spreadsheet, I've got Dylan Wu at 9.5%. Like we could throw him into this lineup, right? He's AM wave, by the way, which kind of sucks. I wish he was PM wave golfer, right? That'd be extremely helpful out there. But yeah, if we like needed to make differentiation happen here, it's not easy to accomplish, right? Like there's a few like 8-9% owned players in the 8K range. We go down here to the 7s, even at the top end of the 7K range, right? Like there's not a bunch of sub 5% owned players. So let's go ahead and throw in like, let's see, who's the lowest owned up there? I guess the lowest 2 would be Peter Kest. He's 6.2%. I've got MJ Daffy, we mentioned before, at 6.9. So let's go ahead and throw Daffy in there just because I do like Daffy this week quite a bit. So we've got, I'd say, 1 pivot at this point, right? Daffy, right, at that kind of ownership would be a pivot. Wu at 10%, like I don't know if I'd call that a pivot, right? He's an 8K golfer and he's 10% owned, right? Like, so we've got 1 pivot in this lineup and we've got 2 spots left, right? And we've got 2 20% owned players and a 10% owned player. Our product ownership on this is not looking great. Let's to say the very least, it's not looking great. So if we had to find some differentiation, like a Ben Martin, right? You could take him for a little bit of differentiation. But with your last spot, like I would have a hard time spending $6,900, right? Like I know a lot of these players are like sub 2% owned. Your last man in this kind of lineup is undoubtedly going to be a pivot. Like it's going to give you some differentiation, but I'm not sure if it's enough. Like you just have so much chalk here. It's not that I'm worried about you duplicating your lineup, right? With this kind of combination, it's lack of leverage, right? I mean, up top, right? If you hit with your top 2 golfers, you're sharing them with 20% of the field. And then with your last 3 spots, you might be getting some sort of leverage, but you've got to hit on all 4, right? If your top 2 guys are going to be chalk that hits, your 4 value plays, which are golfers that aren't really all that good, right? They're value plays for a reason. You've got to hope all end up smashing for you, right? So if you're like in a single entry contest, I hate this kind of build this week. Like it reeks to me, just like a donkey chalk shit lineup that you don't want to go out there and enter. So what I would rather do, right, is try and force in at least 1 pivot up top, right? And by pivot, I mean somebody that's like 10% owned rather than 20. So let's go out there. Let's take a Lucas Glover. Right? I mentioned him as a potential piece of differentiation. And let's start with, let's go a little bit cheaper here. So not only do I want to start with somebody that's a little bit lower owned, right, with a Lucas Glover, but I also want to be a little bit more balanced with our salary. And you're going to see why here in a second. So now that we're at 7,800 remaining as an average, let's go ahead and throw in Davis Riley again as a slightly lower owned play. Let's throw in Dylan Wu as well. So we have 2 AM wave golfers here, which I don't love, but like I said, there are going to be a few AM guys that still get through. So don't feel like you have to fade all the AM wave golfers. And I'm going to have a few in my pool, right? Like I said, it's like a handful. I think I have like 6 players out of the 35 that I'm playing that are AM wave. And a lot of them are here in the 8K range. They're the slightly lower owned leverage plays that I'm getting to. So let's throw those 2 in there. Now we're down to 7,300. We still need a pivot, right? I mean, we got a 20% owned guy in there, a 15% owned guy. Our 2 quote unquote pivots to this point, right, are 10% owned players. We can't sleep on ownership yet, right? We still have to be thinking about that. We can't just be taking chalky piece after chalky piece. So let's go ahead and throw Lipsky in there. He's a PM wave golfer. It's relatively low owned. And then at $7,200, you could probably spend all of your salary here, but just to make sure that you're different, right, to maybe give you a little bit more leverage to the field, maybe you go down to $7,100 and you find your favorite PM guy, right, and you round out that kind of lineup. This kind of lineup's much better suited for a large field GPP because you're going to get some sort of leverage on Glover. I could see him coming in at sub 10%. I know I had him at like 12. Let's see. what was the final ownership number on Glover? I have him at actually 16% ownership. It would not surprise me to see him near 10% in some of the GPPs tomorrow. It's just a hunch that I'm having. I don't think a lot of people are going to play Lucas Glover in this kind of field. And I think people are going to go after that course history angle, right? So whether it's a Ben Griffin below him, Taylor Pendrith, I think is going to suck up a lot of Glover's ownership. Also, Lucas Herbert ahead of him. And even Batia, right? Batia played really well here last year. I think all of those guys are going to suck up some ownership. So don't be surprised if Lucas Glover's maybe even close to 10% ownership. So maybe it's just wishful thinking on my end, hoping that we get a better leverage play. But that's the way I'm thinking when it comes to building my lineups, right? Maybe a little bit more balanced. I'm able to mix in a few of those leverage plays in the 8K range. And let's see, in terms of leverage that's in the PM wave, right, because ideally, right, we want guys in the PM, right? Like Dylan Wu, Davis Riley are playing in the AM wave. In terms of PM wave, Mark Hubbard's 15%. I don't know if I'd call that leverage. We talked about Daffy before, Kest, relatively low owned. Kevin Yu would be a piece of PM leverage. So I want to point out a few more because I can't give you guys all my plays, but I want to give you some here. So like Peter Malnati, right? He's kind of relatively high owned, nearly 9%. Lipsky's at the same price. He's also a PM wave golfer, and he's half the ownership of a Peter Malnati. So I'd rather go Lipsky, right, over Malnati in this sort of lineup. So that's what I'm thinking for a lot of that. And let's go over some of your player pool questions. So thoughts on Kadira. So I like Kadira this week, Josh. I'm actually playing him in a few of my lineups. Last run, I think he was like 5% in my set of 150. So like 7-8 lineups. And I'm playing Kadira. Let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll go over some of the stats with Kadira. So we have multiple questions on him, by the way. So I know people are thinking about him a little bit. So in terms of the shots gained, I want to look at the last 36 rounds, right, to give you an idea of how he's been playing for quite some time. And it hasn't been amazing in any one category, but it hasn't been horrible either, right? He's a slight loser over that sample size, but the category that he's been, I guess let's zoom in a little bit more. Let's see what he's been doing over the last month or so. The iron play is usually pretty good for Kadira, right? You can see here, he's been losing of late, but pretty good around the green, decent off the tee, right? He's not long, but he's really accurate off the tee. And his one tour win, right, where we've seen him go out there and smash before, RBC Heritage, right? Short golf course, similar agronomy style to what you're going to get this week at Bermuda. So if you're looking for a course fit angle, I like Kadira for that reason, right? It's why I'm getting exposure to Satoshi Kadira. I'm also relatively low owned, but just know that the form of late is not good, right? Like the iron play that's usually pretty stout for Kadira. There are times, right, we bring up this last 12 round baseline and we'll see Kadira gaining something like 0.5 or even a stroke gain per round on approach. He's losing 0.7. So that really worries me, right? He's only a large field GPP sort of flyer. I would not take him in a single entry kind of format. But if you're in a large field GPP, you're playing 150 lineups. Yeah, he's the kind of guy I'm getting 5% exposure to, right? Just going out there, trying to get my 2x the field on that sort of player. And, there's not a lot of events that you can play Satoshi Kadira. I mean, this is a very short player, right? He's at a longer golf course that demands length. He's going to have a really hard time being competitive. But at this sort of track that's only 6,800 yards, he can hit a bunch of the wedges, which is kind of what he's known for with that iron play. He's not the best putter, but he can get a little hot, right, with the flat stick from time to time. Those are the kind of tracks where he comes into play. So I'm okay with Kadira this week. I'm getting some exposure myself as well. In terms of pure punts, I am playing Brian Gay. There are actually quite a few punts down here that I'm playing. Kevin Roy's one too. Actually, down here at $6,700. It's a wide open field, and there are a bunch down here. There's at least 4 or 5 I can just see on this list of players that I'm playing this week. It's not like I need the salary relief either, right? Up top, I mean, pricing is pretty soft to begin with, right? We don't have like an 11K golfer this week. And on top of that, you're not trying to jam in like a bunch of 9, 10K golfers this week, right? It's a shit field. Those guys are all way overpriced compared to where they should normally be. It's just that these sort of players, I'm just going to point out a few, like a Ryan Armour, right? Kevin Roy. We mentioned Brian Gay, right? I mean, his course history. I mean, let's look at Brian Gay's course history. It's outstanding, right? T11, T12 win, T3 finish the last 4 years here at Port Royal. And he's short as hell off the tee, right? He's accurate. He's just a really good putter. That's exactly what Ryan Armour is. That's exactly what like a Kevin Roy can do. A Martin Trainer does that same sort of shit. a lot of the players in this range are that same type of golfer. So it's not really the price tag for why I'm getting down to some of these 6K golfers. It's because I legitimately think they're going to play well because they fit the golf course. That's what we see every single year. So I wanted to point that out as well. There's a lot of exposure down there I'm getting. In terms of props, let's hop over to the PGA side. I'm not playing anything on Underdog. They only have one board up here. It's only strokes. So if you wanted to go ahead and enter, anything correlated, so let's say like 2 unders on strokes, well, they block you from doing so, right? They won't even let you go out there and enter this kind of slip. So just give you an idea, right? I'll try and enter 2 unders on strokes. It's going to give you this error message. Pick duplicated, right? You can't enter the same side on any one of your pick'em slips. Pretty annoying. So I'm going to avoid that on Underdog. Prize Picks has a very similar board and not nearly the same kind of stipulation. So if you're going to play props around 1, do it on Prize Picks as what we're going to do right now. So in terms of my Prize Picks exposure, there is quite a bit that I've gone to already. Ben Griffin would be my favorite prop by far on the entire board. They've got him at 4.5 birdies. When it's calm out there, like it's going to be tomorrow afternoon, birdie average is typically in the 4.5 to 4.8 range at this golf course. Ben Griffin was a top 50 birdie maker on tour this year, and that's for the entire PGA Tour, right? This field, he's a top 5 birdie maker out of the entire field. So you've got a player that's already, right, pretty good pedigree when it comes to making birdies, a golf course that he loves, right? He top 5'd at last year, and then playing in the better conditions in the afternoon. And last year, Ben Griffin covered this in all 4 rounds. I know he finished top 5, right? Went out there, had a hell of a week out there, but pretty solid track record, right? If we're going out there and trying to look at the stats. So this is my favorite prop by far. To give you guys another one for this sake of this live stream, let's go ahead and throw in the Taylor Pendrith one. It's another piece of exposure that I got to. I'm not nearly as bullish on Pendrith as I am Ben Griffin this week, but Pendrith, another player that has elite course history, right? Went out there, finished top 5 his first start at this golf course. And on top of that is on sports books, right? So we can compare some of the odds on Fanduel compared to what we have here on Prize Picks. And he's minus 150 over 4.5 on Fanduel. So if you're looking at it from the plus EV side, I think he was like plus 130 for the under. So it's not the kind of prop, right? But there's only one bet that you can make, right? A lot of the biggest scam in sportsbooks, by the way, is I'll see cappers out there being like, oh, this player's minus 140 for an anytime TD. And it'll be like on Draftkings or Fanduel when you can't even bet on the under, right? So it's like a one-sided prop. Just know that those kind of bets have a lot of hidden juice on them, right? They completely tax you when it comes to the actual odds. Fortunately for us on Fanduel, they do let you bet on the under, on some of the unders on birdies, and which means they have to give you fairer odds, like give you odds that make a little bit more sense. And he's minus 150 towards the over. So if you're somebody that loves plus EV plays, I look at odds, right? I let it help my process a little bit, but it's definitely not the end all be all. I've seen it flop before, especially out there on golf that is so dependent on the weather. And he's another PM wave golfer that's going out there in pretty pristine conditions, right? So for me, I like these plays a little bit more so because they have the good course history. They're going out in the better conditions. But if you're somebody that is looking at it from the plus EV perspective, it would check that box for you too, right? If that's your kind of thing. If you're looking at Eurogolf, I am going to point out this Max Homa prop. This Max Homa prop is mispriced. In fact, this entire board is mispriced over here for Eurogolf. And let me show you why. It's really straightforward, actually, why it's mispriced. All you have to do is bring up the averages from this golf tournament, right? So let's go ahead and do that on Data Golf. So when it comes to the Dead Bait Golf Challenge, which is like a limited field event, not that many golfers out there playing this week, it's played over par every year that they've been here. So 2022, it played 0.08 over par, right? So just a little bit over par, but that's a 72.08 average. In 2019, it played 0.44 over par. Back in 2018, it played 0.39 over par. And then back in 2017, it played 0.61 over par. You can see your winning scores, right? We're like 11 under. It was 15 under, 12 under. And then last time out was just 11 under par. So for somebody on Prize Picks, let me go ahead and circle back to that now. So for somebody on Prize Picks to be projected at 69.5 strokes, it means they'd have to shoot -3, right? To go out there and cover this kind of prop. Well, if you went out there and shot -3 all 4 rounds, that wins last year, right? That wins 4 years ago. That finishes in second place the last time out that they played this. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? To be projecting somebody to shoot 3 under par when that wins this golf tournament half the time, if you do that for all 4 days, right? And we shouldn't be projecting golfers on a 50 by 50 basis to go out there and win the golf tournament. I mean, let's be real. A guy like Max Homa is like 10-1 to win this golf tournament for a reason, right? He's not even odds to go out there and win this golf tournament. So if you're going to look to pair anything up, I know I pointed out that Pendrith prop, but my favorite prop out of anything is this Max Homa prop. Another reason I like the Max Homa prop is he's been really bad outside the US. I don't know if it's like a style of golf thing or maybe it's like jet lag. I mean, it could be a million different things, right? With Max Homa, he's been really bad outside the USA. So you've got that going too. So I would say to have golfers projected to win the golf tournament on a 50 by 50 basis is pretty crazy. And then, yeah, to have Ben Griffin out there at this 4.5 projection, I think is just as crazy too, right? I mean, he went out there, he covered this all 4 rounds last year. He's a top 5 birdie maker in this field and going off in the perfect conditions. So I'll leave you guys with that in terms of exposure. I got quite a bit here. I played it on Prize Picks and hopefully Hard Rock Bet. I was mentioning that before, guys. Hopefully they start offering some player props too, because that would be super sick to get some exposure to. But outside of that, that is all I've got. I've got a bunch of NBA stuff to get to. Speaking of, I've got 24 minutes to go out there and do that. So going to go ahead and leave you guys now. Justin says, in Luke we trust. Appreciate you, Justin. Thank you for stopping on by. Let's go out there and have ourselves a week. Hopefully you see a few of your names towards the top of the leaderboards. A few closing remarks, right, for DFS guys. Looks like there's a PM AM wave, right? Lean into that. Try and take advantage of that as much as you can. And then for props, looks pretty easy tomorrow, especially in the PM wave. So if you're going to play anything prop-wise, stick to the PM guys just like you are for some of your DFS lineups. I think you'll have yourself a week out there. So I appreciate all the support, you guys. Check out the Patreon if you want access to all the props that I'm playing, also all the spreadsheets that you see throughout the videos. But until next time, appreciate the support and best of luck out there.